Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 7. We're going to cover our first Canadian serial killer, Vancouver to be exact. This is Gilbert Paul Jordan, also known as the Boozing Barber, and that's because his weapon of choice was alcohol. Between 1965 and 1988, he targeted prostitutes in the Vancouver area. He would pay them for a good time and encourage them to drink heavily. Once they passed out, he would force more liquor down their throats, until they eventually succumbed to alcohol poisoning. In 1988, he was linked to the death of a woman in a hotel room. He was convicted of manslaughter and linked to the deaths of 9 other women. He served a mere 6 years and then was released on probation. He then violated his probation and did another year. In 2005, he was back on the streets and police even issued a warning about how dangerous he was. But he went silent and died in 2006. Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 11. These are the Dnipropetrovsk maniacs, Viktor Saynenko and Igor Supranyuk, responsible for 21 murders in 21 days. These events took place in 2007 in the Ukraine. There was a third accomplice, Alexander Honza, but we'll talk about him later. The 3 boys born in 1988 all came from wealthy, influential families. They attended school together and all had several phobias, which they dealt with in some strange ways. To combat their fear of heights, they would stand on the edge of their apartment building. Alexander had hemophobia, the fear of blood. That's when they began torturing animals and posing in pictures with them. After they graduated high school, they moved on to armed robbery, but it wasn't long until that wasn't enough. On July 25th, 2007, their killing spree began. Each of their victims was completely random, bludgeoning them with blunt objects such as hammers and construction bars. Some of these were even recorded and leaked on the web. So if you've ever heard of 3 guys, 1 hammer, this is them. A 14-year-old survivor is what brought this to the public eye. Initially, the police actually thought the survivor was the murderer. The investigation was kept secret at first. Eventually, sketches were distributed and stolen items at pawn shops were recovered. A week after their terrible spree ended, they were finally arrested. Igor was caught red-handed trying to sell one of his victims' mobile phones. They raided the home of the accomplice Alexander Honza, where they recovered more stolen phones he attempted to flush down the toilet. All 3 of them pled guilty to their crimes. There was talk that they were trying to get rich off of these videos, saying that a rich website owner ordered 40 snuff films. The details of their crimes are far too graphic for me to talk about on TikTok, but I will say almost every victim was unrecognizable. Despite their family's wealth and power, Victor and Igor were both sentenced to life in prison. As for the accomplice Alexander, he was sentenced to 9 years for armed robbery. He never actually participated in the murders. Their horrific crimes still circulate the internet to this day. I've talked about a lot of serial killers on here, but these 2 might top the list. Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 4. This is Nikolai Zumagaliyev. He was also known as Metal Fang, because of his unusual false teeth made of white metal, terrorizing women in Kazakhstan between 1979 and 1980. He said his main goal was to rid the world of prostitutes. He would lure women into parks at night and hack them up with an axe or a knife. He was also infamous for cannibalism, serving the meat of his victims to friends at dinner parties. During one of his parties, 2 men discovered a severed head and intestines in his kitchen, which ultimately led to his arrest. He was charged with 7 murders total. Some speculate that it could be anywhere between 50 and 100 victims. The courts found him guilty and declared him insane, committed to a mental institute in Uzbekistan. He actually escaped from here for 2 years and was thankfully recaptured. Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 1. This is Ronald Steele of Canonsburg, Pennsylvania. He was an accomplished karate expert and instructor, but in June of 1985, he decided the punching bags weren't enough. He abducted 3 elderly women from Washington County and took them into the woods, where he beat them to death karate style. That's exactly what the police report says. In March of 1988, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. It took the jury mere minutes to decide this. And in March 2009, he was finally put to death by lethal injection. Follow for more. Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 12. This is Clifford Robert Olson, but better known as the Beast of British Columbia. Referred to as Canada's first true boogeyman, he is responsible for the murders of 11 children and young adults. Surprisingly, he was raised in a stable home with no signs of abuse. His first ever arrest came at the age of 13 for theft. Said to be a bully, a show-off, and rumored to torture animals. Throughout his adulthood, he was arrested dozens of times for fraud, robbery, firearm charges. He even escaped from prison several times. On November 17, 1980, he abducted a young girl in British Columbia. Her body was tragically discovered on Christmas Day, strangled with a belt and stabbed repeatedly. On April 16, 1981, another young woman disappeared. It was 5 months before the body was discovered, and by then, he had claimed another. In May of 1981, just 4 days after his wedding, he struck again. In July of the same year, he claimed 6 more victims in rapid succession. That is 10 victims in 9 months. On July 30th, he claimed his final victim, a 17-year-old. Due to all the varying aspects, the police didn't initially link the crimes together, but it wasn't long until they realized they were dealing with a serial killer. He was immediately a prime suspect due to his lengthy criminal record. He was questioned, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. Finally arrested on August 12th for trying to abduct 2 more girls. Upon questioning, he suggested quite a controversial deal. He would confess to all 11 murders and show them where the bodies were, but they had to pay his wife $10,000 for each victim. With a lack of evidence and desperate to give the families a decent burial, the police actually agreed. She was given $100,000. He also agreed to give up the location of the 11th victim for free. He received 11 life sentences, but thankfully just fucking died on October 3rd, 2011. Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 2. This is Alexander Rubel, convicted of 6 murders at the age of 17. Occurring in the city Tallinn in Estonia, this happened between 1997 and 1998. First starting his reign of terror on a handicapped neighbor. He said at that time he had a desire to kill anybody. Throughout the next few months, his reign of terror continued, slashing the throat of a 15-year-old girl and decapitating an innocent man with an axe. He also claimed to be high on gasoline vapors during each murder. Sentenced as a minor for only 8 years, the maximum time allowed by law. Released in June 2006 and walks amongst us today. Follow for more.
Let's talk about a Canadian serial killer that you've probably never heard of. Gilbert Paul Jordan was otherwise known as the Boozing Barber. He got this name because he used alcohol poisoning as his method of murder. He was the first serial killer to have this modus operandi. He was linked to 8 to 10 deaths of female Indigenous sex workers between 1965 and 1986 in downtown Vancouver. He would hire these women, get them drunk, and once they passed out, he would force alcohol down their throats. The highest blood alcohol level of one of his victims was 0.79. He was convicted of 1 charge of manslaughter, was sentenced to 15 years, got it reduced to 9 on an appeal, and only served 6. He was released in the 90s, and by the year 2000, he had been charged with negligence to cause bodily harm, administering alcohol, SA, assault. Oh, such a surprise, he was a repeat offender. He was arrested a couple more times for breaking probation because he was drinking and also was possessing alcohol around women. Upon his release, police literally issued a public warning. Now, from what I gather, he never really stopped getting in trouble with the law, and he ended up dying at the age of 74 in 2006. According to Amnesty.ca, between 1980 and 2012, over 1,000 Indigenous women were murdered in Canada, and 63 sex workers were murdered between 1991 and 1995 in Canada. And I really had to search for that information. I couldn't even find any recent data, which I feel like in itself says a lot. And the source I used was an archived one from Public Safety Canada. I'm going to link this petition in the comments. I highly encourage you to take the time to sign it.
Serial Killers You've Never Heard of, Part 9. This is Hilda Nilsson, also known as the Angel Maker on Brook Street. She is recognized as Sweden's worst female serial killer. Between 1915 and 1917, she murdered 8 children. For a fee, she would care for infants and children. At the time, it was known as baby farming. She would place them into a wash tub with heavy objects on top of them, and would either burn or bury the bodies. In 1917, her horrible crimes finally came to light. The police were contacted after one woman was denied contact with her child. On June 15, 1917, she was sentenced to death by guillotine. That execution never took place because she took her own life in jail.